and we'll just get into it. All right, so we're doing chapters 6 to 10, and mainly that covers a lot of kind of basic math between introduction to pot odds, implied odds, and then it kind of goes into like common outs and how to calculate this stuff quickly. And I'm not going to cover a lot of the math, basically. It's some more of the discussion kind of that comes up, but skimming through chapter 6, Alton Hardin teaches us two ways to basically do pot odds. And the first way is the ratio method. You know, you're kind of getting 3 to 1 or 2 to 1, and you base your decisions off that way. And that's simply the pot size, what it is to call. And the pot size does not include your call yet. And the way that's more familiar to me or more comfortable to me, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is the percentage ways. And that's your risk to reward ratio, which is basically what you call divided by the pot size plus call. So, you know, if you're getting 3 to 1, then that's just 1 divided by 3 plus 1, basically is how you do the ratios and percentages. And I'm curious about your guys' thoughts on this right here. I personally greatly prefer equity when I'm looking at calculations and odds for poker. I think it makes it more relatable when it comes to understanding my own kind of equity. And, you know, I wasn't sure if you guys are in the same boat or if you prefer kind of odds to different situations or anything like that.
I appreciate the discussion between the two because I really hadn't thought it out. But my gut reaction was percentages, which I guess in relation to what you're saying is equity.
Yes. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, the pot odds come down into percentage, which then is easily kind of comparable to equity, right? Instead of thinking like, oh, I have like 25% equity here, and then I'm getting like, oh, 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. Maybe there's kind of like a little extra step in the computation comparing a ratio to a fraction that in my mind, it's just easier if you're just looking at percentage versus percentage instead of ratio versus fraction. While there are opportunities, say like pre-flop, maybe if you're getting 3-bet, it's like, oh, I'm getting 2 to 1 here. That's an easy call, kind of stuff like that. So I think both have merits and it's kind of player dependent, but overall, I personally prefer the percentage method. So the chapter goes on to basically just say that this stuff, when you're doing all of it, rounding is okay. And, you know, there are going to be some circumstances where, you know, pot odds are kind of like the end all be all of a decision, but also you're supposed to be working pot odds and implied odds and equity all together. And I was wondering if you guys personally have any situations where pot odds kind of come to the forefront of your decision, or if discussion question number 2 is if you kind of like fudge pot odds a little bit based on, say, like a read or a tell or your own sort of strategy. And for example, when it comes down to me, pot odds, I hate playing like 4 bets out of position. And if I'm not getting like, even if I'm getting the proper pot odds basically to continue pre-flop, I am more inclined to kind of bail out of the hand, even though, and that's where I'm making a decision that's basically the pot odds are there, but I'm kind of worried about what the pot odds actually say in my ability to play the hand later on. And I was wondering if you guys relate to that in any circumstance where you may just sort of value pot odds more than anything else.
There are times where I value pot odds less. For example, if I'm drawing to a straight and it's like 3 or 4 ways, and there's also a draw to the flush, it's kind of like, yeah, I might be able to get paid, but the likelihood of someone hitting a better hand is higher. You know, basically that's, even if I'm getting the right pot odds, it's kind of like I don't know if how helpful that next card's going to be. So
that's tremendous. And that's kind of like a good leeway into the next chapter, which is implied odds. Because what you're saying is, yeah, the pot odds are good, but you know, maybe your odds are discounted or dirty, or you're just not super confident in exactly the pot odds you're getting, that it actually they're as valuable. So
or confident that you're going to get paid.
There's
that too. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a scare card, exactly. Now, like the former top pair just kind of doesn't pay off because the board gets too wet. So super likely because, we know that this happens all the time. People have human tendencies and the board changes and things change. So chapter 7 is all about implied odds, which are essentially the future odds that are being offered to your call currently. And there's no exact formula for implied odds. It's more of kind of like, well, I think I either have a lot of implied odds or a little bit. So it makes them calculating interesting because it's more of like a mental math kind of presumption sort of thing. And so he then goes to talk about some circumstances where we may have good implied odds versus bad implied odds. And that relates to a lot of the kind of different things in poker that are important. Like, is a player a nit or is he a maniac and he's going to blast off? Obviously, the maniac has better implied odds against than a nit. Position, it's easier in position. That gives us better implied odds. If we have more stack depth and the person's not like a short stacker, just all great stuff for implied odds, including like the visibility of the draw. So it's not just like an obvious flush draw. We could have like some sort of gutter or double gutter, things like that are a little bit more sneaky.
In relationship to that, to the short stacker, I make the assumption that I shouldn't be playing a long odds against a short stacker because, if I get there, it's not a great reward because they're short. Is that the correct way to think about it?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, one of the thoughts about implied odds, or when people think about it, if I hit, I'm guaranteed to get that person's stack. And with a short stacker having a reduced SPR, maybe you're more inclined to get paid when you hit. But obviously, the reward is just guaranteed to be less because they just have less money in their stack. So I would say it's somewhat villain dependent, and how likely they're not going to be able to fold. Like maybe they have a top pair and your draw is kind of sneaky and they're going to pay off anyway. But generally, yeah, playing or counting on implied odds against a short stacker is not great because they don't always pay off. And then the 2 out of 3 times you miss to get there, you just kind of like played into their strength and you don't really get the reward the 1 out of 3 times that you do get there, basically.
Uh-huh.
So that's just maybe one way to look at it. It's maybe a little bit more cautious, but it definitely.
So like an ace queen off versus a dry low flop, and they, they got, say they came in for, say they got 30 blinds behind. It's probably not worth chasing that ace or queen. It seems like. Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, it depends on how much pressure. Like ace high may be the best hand, and maybe you have some backdoor to the straight equity kind of stuff like that.
With a low dry flop, sure, there might be a wheel down there, but
maybe. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is the pot odds, that they're directly laying you. If they're going kind of really hard at the pot, your ace high is probably not good, and your kind of equity drawing out on them may not be great too. But if they're then offering you like a range bet, it seems like a nice spot to float.
I'd say that a mistake that I see a lot of other players make is they chase the win without considering their expected value. So they want that feeling of winning. They want to hit their ace or queen in your situation without thinking about whether or not you actually have the odds to call against that tiny stack.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just figuring it's like the math of it. So we're in, standard single race pot. It's like, but 7 bigs, they got 25 behind. It just seems like it's certainly, I see what you're saying as far as if I can get them off the hand with a bet, go for it. But if they're sticky and they're just, a lot of them, I feel like when they come on in, they're just looking to get that, try to double up that short stack, and they're not going away with a lot of stuff. So it just feels like it's more of the time I feel like I'm folding, and that's typically what I'm doing. It feels like the right decision.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, short stackers generally know how to play their equity a bit better, just because they're just, the SPR is less. And if they have initiative, they basically kind of know how to play their hand a little bit better. So you're going to be playing more of like a bluff catching kind of game, which is not generally the best way to do because, the reward of hitting just isn't as great. And plus, like Rollo was just saying, this is part of maybe the discussion question number 2 and how we can miscalculate or misuse some of these implied odds. Like maybe your ace isn't even clean. Maybe they're going crazy because they have bottom pair with an ace kicker and your ace is going to be counterfeit to 2 pair, or maybe they already have a set and you're basically essentially drawing dead even if you hit your ace or queen.
Right.
And that's basically something that I'll say out of my own kind of relationship with implied odds is for a long time, I didn't really actually count the fact that I could be drawing dead to some weird, like maybe they already have quads or there's like a weird boat on board. And you didn't really think that they could have that like 2 pair that just, filled up and you think you're still alive and you're kind of going at them. But it turns out that you were dead in the water. And you were, thinking that you had huge, insane implied odds, but without realizing that, part of your range is already dead to where they're at.
Yeah.
This is a little bit superstitious, but I find that every time I chase a flush on a paired board, I'm behind a full house.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Then you get there and, you curse exactly like the server and the software and the poker site. And it's like, oh, of course. But, like you should have bailed earlier. But I totally agree with that sentiment.
One of the ones that hits me is when I make top pair on the turn with a good kicker, and then the gut shot straight comes in on the river, and I never saw it. It might be like a 5-8 flopped, and then whatever would be a 6 comes on the turn, and I didn't see how that made a straight for them because they came in with it and held with that crap.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's why implied odds are huge. I mean, generally you're only putting something like 20 BBs maybe into the pot by the flop and turn. And on the river, you're playing with like 60 to 80 BBs behind, and, somebody hits that gut shot. It's like, all right, sweet. You're getting, a huge stack on the river. And that's why, that's like the thrill of chasing an implied odds for a lot of like fish and people is the huge payoff at the end. So I'm going to move on to chapter 8, I guess. And chapter 8 is kind of just basic. I mean, it takes me back to like the very beginnings of when I learned about poker. And it's like, oh yeah, I have a flush draw. That's 9 outs. And in a straight draw is 8 outs, but maybe some of those outs are counterfeit to the flush. So it's really 6. And so this chapter is basically, it's pretty much like if it's new information at this point, it would be kind of surprising, but it's basically like a very nice review chapter for someone just getting into poker where, if you have 2 overcards, there's 3 of each overcard to come, which is 6 outs. And it talks a lot about basically just kind of some of these common draws that we should know. And then it talks about discounted outs, which we were talking about before when potentially, we're drawing to a straight and there's, flush on board. So we have to discount some of our outs. And then like we're saying, the worst thing is kind of, it's almost discounted outs, but dirty outs where you say you hit your card to bring in a straight and the other person gets in like a higher end of the straight. So all kind of things that we have to be very sort of common and aware of. I wasn't sure. I don't really do a lot of thinking about, oh, I have a flush draw here. That means I'm about to hit about a third of the time. It still happens and still part of the calculation, but I've definitely kind of shifted more into like, oh, my range is really strong here. That means I can continue pushing equity that way instead of just thinking about the draw portion of my range. And as GTOs kind of progressed, I wasn't sure. I wanted to hear from other people, maybe how you relate to this. Is it just kind of in circumstances where we're calling, we're thinking about like draw odds in that relationship, or are we kind of like moving into range versus range equities, or how do you guys kind of deal with some of this stuff?
I was so excited for this chapter because in the midst of all this, I'm like, holy shit, I actually do some of this compared to all that other stuff, which I'm completely foreign to. Sorry, my dog. But yeah, that's my relation. That's as deep as I get, is I actually think about these things.
That's good. That's super good. I mean, that you basically, if you're not thinking about that stuff, then what are you doing? You're kind of clicking buttons and just not realizing like you're getting blown away in terms of equity. Yeah, you know, and that's where like EV is. You're either like making some sort of good calls or you're not making good calls. So it's definitely great to prioritize some of that stuff, for sure.
I think of it in terms of being able to bluff with equity if I've got the right draws.
That's huge. So yeah. So in your head, you think like, all right, you know, I'm like 20% to make this year, maybe on the next street, but you know, the odds I'm laying, I have an additional like maybe 30% bluff equity, which, you know, turns out to be just a ton of equity.
Yep.
All right, that's nice. So yeah, I think that's really, really important, especially kind of like on the turn with one card to come, and some of these decisions just become like so much more kind of real, and quickly adding up those different types of equity in our head can be like super important and super valuable. Do you guys ever target? Do you ever think, oh, it's just so clear, like the villain here is on a draw, and then you kind of like readjust your betting size to that? Is that, I'll do that sometimes for sure. Like I can't, like, what else does this guy have other than a draw? And I'll kind of like blast away and give him bad pot odds. Pretty standard to do. I mean, I definitely think so.
I've started doing that a little bit. When it's obvious that they're on the flush draw, I will bomb the turn, try and get them off of it.
I think that's really, you know, it's kind of like, I guess it's not supposed to be GTO, but if we look at GTO as like this whole thing of ranges, and if we can carve out a huge section of the range that is a draw, then why not go after that draw and like kind of punish it to the max? So yeah, I think that's kind of actually really important to do sometimes, is if your intuition is on point enough and your reads are that strong, yeah, absolutely, kind of like, you know, smash that part of the range that you're identifying.
I'm just beginning to open that door. I mean, it's like just got it creaked open and just a little bit of light's coming out from it, but I love that it's becoming part of my game.
That's awesome. It feels good, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Definitely. And it makes you like way more formidable to play competent kind of like exploitive poker like that. It definitely is, it's definitely important. So I'm glad to hear that's going well for you. So the last kind of two chapters are the rules of 2 and 4, which was, I mean, I wish I could remember what my first kind of book in poker was, but this is like another mind-blowing concept at the time, and it was just so simple. But Alton, the author, considers this one of the most important things when it comes as a major skill advantage over the beginner, is to quickly count your outs. It's a 2-step process. You count your outs, then you multiply by either 2 or 4, depending on where you're at the hand. It's a very simple equity way to calculate your draw equity. Super, super simple. You know, you just count it by 2 if you're going from the flop to the turn, or the turn to the river, or 4 if you're all in on the flop, basically, to count how much equity you would have with the remaining cards to come. And the reason this approximation works is because there's either 47 or 46 cards left in the deck, right? And that's close to essentially close to 1 over 2, basically, or you get 1 over 50, basically, which is 2%. So that's the reason that kind of works, is we're taking 1 card at a time. That's essentially like 1 over 50, which is like 2%. So it's not exact. It's pretty darn close. It's only off by like 1 to 3% or so. And when it's off, it's usually when you have a lot more odds, and it kind of works out in your favor in that circumstance. But you know, you're not so worried about it counting exact equity if you have a 15+ outer that basically says like, you know, I have a tremendous amount of the pot that belongs to me, and you can go with it. And so I was wondering, you know, in your guys' sort of poker journey, when it comes to the rules of 2 and 4, how are you using it in a hand? And are you using it, say, more proactively? Or me, I generally use it more reactively when I'm facing like, you know, large check raise on the flop or something like that. And I'm like, oh crap, I got to get, here's my equity, my draw equity from drawing, something like that.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of use it reactively. I don't use it proactively that often. I'm pretty proud of myself when I do, but yeah, most of the time reactively.
Yeah, this is one I've heard of course. I've heard of all this, but putting it all together and having it make sense in game I never pursued it, so I never understood it, so I never did it.
Okay.
But and especially with this book, I peeked ahead because chapter 11's like bring it all together, and I'm like, light bulb went off. It was like, oh my god, this is actually all making sense. Holy shit! Because before it was, I don't care if I'm getting 1,000,000 to 1. If I know I'm beat kind of mentality, because I didn't understand it. But seeing how it can influence decisions and something simple like this in game when you're, the clock's running down and you can't do the complex equations, something like this was actually pretty helpful.
That's amazing. Yeah. I'm glad it all like the chapter, whatever it is, 2 chapters from now, that's all starting to like congeal for you basically. But yeah, I mean, we need all these tools in the hand to basically kind of figure this stuff out as quickly as possible. And the rule of 2 of 4, once you have that down, it makes kind of planning the hand and reacting to certain circumstances just so much easier. And it is like a total light bulb kind of moment. I mean, in terms of some people just don't do this. They don't consider how much equity they have. They're just kind of going for it. There's, any draw is a good draw basically.
Right.
So maybe in some sense.
I'm glad you pointed it out like that though, because sadly I've used it for a lot of years, but usually as a reinforcement to a bad beat story. So I guess reflectively I'm using it, but I got to start using it. What was the other term you used in the
Just
moment?
more proactively.
In the hand? Say again.
Just more proactively.
Proactively. I need to use it like that. So thank you for phrasing it like that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that definitely kind of on some level when you kind of have a surprise reaction to something in poker, in a lot of sense, it's like, well, I just wasn't kind of thinking ahead and I maybe should have saw this coming and stuff like that. So whenever I kind of like, oh crap, I'm having this reactive moment and I'm thinking about 2s and 4s and like the equity and stuff like that, then makes me, if I'm reviewing that hand, generally makes me step back 1 step further and be like, oh man, should I have expected that? Should I have not have been kind of like gotten caught with my like pants down in that circumstance and trying to figure stuff out. So,
but to use it proactively, using it on my action and using it to put that money in, and that, I think that's like a much better way to use it.
Definitely. Yeah. Whatever kind of a thought process check down you have in your head to go through a hand where you're standing, it's definitely kind of, if you think like, oh yeah, I have X amount of odds and this percentage to improve, or they have X amount of odds and this percentage to improve. It definitely adds a lot of kind of future planning to your thinking and planning for the hand. And it really helps out a lot when you start using it more proactively. So that's kind of the basics to pot odds and implied odds. And the next chapter, he just starts to go into the intro of EV, which is, it's not really mathy yet. And we'll just kind of talk about it a little bit. Just to go through it, the intro to EV is how much you're to win in a specific situation. It has a short and long-term focus, right? Because whatever the formula is, when you're calculating EV for anything, it can be over many, many, many iterations with variance and change and everything like that. So you can have the EV for a particular hand, or you can have the EV for that circumstance if you run it hundreds of times or thousands of times. But it has a short and long-term focus, so we can talk about it exactly in a hand or as EV relates to like an overall strategy. EV has a lot of other kind of things going on for it. The gist of it is, yeah, like winning poker is plus EV, but there can be also things that contribute to both plus EV and minus EV that are not basically related to the direct poker math, things that are off the table or kind of in our life that can change EV as well. Before we get into kind of that discussion, one of the discussion questions here is there a particular EV that you prioritize for? For example, like, it's a really easy EV to collect for a while is that range C bet, because people were overfolding, and all that overfolding just generally meant that extra EV was coming your way just by applying like the range C bet. People weren't defending enough. And so learning that strategy, the range C bet strategy, was like a huge source of EV for a while that kind of like prioritized. There's just playing the river well can be like a very, very difficult and kind of massive source of EV, correct calls and incorrect calls and stuff like that. So there's different ways that we can kind of like target and think about and try to use EV to help us and strengthen our game. And I wasn't sure if you guys had any kind of particular avenue in your like relationship to EV right now where we're thinking about it a lot, or your strategies kind of like trying to get better at this aspect of capturing EV.
I'd say that all of the courses, which I think all of us have taken through Chasing Poker Greatness or the Village, they're all about EV, and knowing that betting 1/3 on certain flops is going to be better than betting pot or 2/3 it's a good thing to know, and knowing which one is more EV. Like the 66% bet narrows their range, which means it's going to be harder to fold them out on the turn. 33% bet keeps in a wider range. Good if you have overcards. Just, again, basically generating EV with the right bet sizes.
Definitely. Super important and super kind of difficult to calculate all that stuff. But once you do have a strategy that kind of shows you where the EV is, like hammering away and doing that over and over and over again, just generates so much like small amounts of EV, which is, you know, what all we're trying to do is just capture kind of like easy, more EV that our opponents may just be given to us. And so kind of like they don't really do any math, but generally the idea of EV, I just clipped out a little kind of tree here, is basically you have the probability of a call. And if a call happens, you have two reactions. Either you call and you win, or you call and you lose. And both of those things have a certain probability and dollar amount attached to it. And the same thing is true if they fold and you win the pot immediately. So kind of as a precursor to what we'll be discussing more about EV in the future, it's basically thinking about EV is if you can think about trees in your head and there's a fold and there's a call and I win and a call and I lose, kind of stuff like that. That's kind of what EV is. And you add it all up and then you kind of get your EV, which we'll cover more in the future as the book gets more into it. But I want to talk about EV that is essentially off the table, because things can really impact us for EV and things that we do that are basically not directly related to poker. For generally some people, that's like, you know, a good night's sleep basically, or maybe doing some warm-ups beforehand and stuff like that. Not playing like drunk maybe is like a plus EV kind of thing like that. I wasn't sure if there's any kind of major changes or decisions or realizations in your guys' path along the way that, you know, you really increased your poker EV by something that you did off the table.
Certainly the study of poker boot camp over and over it's given me a lot more plus EV situations than when I follow it. And I notice the loss of it when I get away from it.
It's a quick punisher like that. I mean, yeah, exactly. You're just by having a range domination over most people and kind of like the ability to have a nice balanced range where you can play out flops and turns and rivers and all these things. Yeah, a solid strategy right there. And realizing that every time you engage in a solid strategy, you're making a little bit of EV every time. That's huge.
Yeah, and then adding the content from Fish and Barrel of having a post flop plan that's also been a positive EV move, particularly as it stacks so well on the pre-flop ranges. And now I'm only just bringing in the use of what to do versus the donk bet, which I still got to study it, but a small sample has some positive results with that too. So just building the strategies and working on doing that has definitely been helping a lot. I will also say though, like when I'm not well rested, whether, just having something to drink or whatnot, definitely seeing a negative EV on that too. So cutting that more out of the game, even though it's fun to play that way sometimes, but at those times it's like, okay, I got to, jump down the stakes and play something that doesn't hurt at all to lose a stack.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it can be super enjoyable sometimes, but like, you know, I never used to care about live poker as much because that was like my vacation from playing online poker, one hand an hour. Like, I'm going to show up and like just make bad EV decisions of like drinking more and stuff like that, or maybe like splashing around a little bit more. And by the time I got done playing live poker, I was realizing the amount of like mistakes I was just kind of like compounding minus EV stake mistakes. It just, you know, it's going to be like a bloodbath. I'm not playing anywhere close to like good poker, and why even bother? Sometimes if you're just going to go in there and like just give all your opponents like all these little EV advantages that you're just basically giving away.
Right.
Yeah, you should talk. I mean, if you want to hear people who really maximize stuff, like Gethin at one point when he was super into like S&G's heads up sit and goes, he was doing stuff like his sleeping regimen, and he was like studying other people's games down to like the smallest little intricacy to get like an extra like half a point of like EV and stuff like that. And, you know, some people can go extremely, extremely far with it. And it's, you know, it'll pay off. There's always more EV to be had. And so sometimes it's just simpler and easier to do, and sometimes it's just harder. So that's kind of like the discussion that I had planned going through these chapters here today. I wasn't sure if you guys had any other further questions or anything like that. We only have about a couple more minutes before my Zoom craps out because I'm a nit and I'm not paying for Pro Zoom.
I appreciate you leading us in this and the work you're doing with the PowerPoints and everything. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I hope it's helpful. As just something to review and think about. You know, I didn't obviously cover a lot of just like basic math kind of equations in that. I figure, you know, if you want to look up more stuff for pot odds and implied odds and like do the math yourself, that's kind of good. But I figure we kind of had like a nice discussion in figuring out our human player tendencies is kind of really important as how we relate to these things like pot odds and implied odds and draws and outs and everything. Cool. So
I recommend the audiobook as well as the hard copy. I've been doing both, and it's just resonated with me. Just for those that are struggling with one or the other, combining the two has been tremendous for me.
Nice.
That's a recommendation.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Are you up to, what chapter are you up to? Are you up to this week's chapter in 10?
I got to 11 just because
Oh,
I
you
was
got to 11. You
ambitious,
got to the
but
EV.
I'm staying with the program, but yeah, I'm.
That's right. Okay, you got to. That's right. Cool. Awesome. Next week I'll probably do 4 more chapters or so, 4 to 5 more, and then we'll finish up with the 2 weeks later after that, the last like 5 or so. And I'll have some good discussion questions again. And I appreciate you guys being here.
If you can I listened to it on Google Play, so I didn't have to buy the audio. I just took my regular book and put it into Google Play, and
Nice.
You can play it out loud there. So.
Oh, that's nice. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I just had some random old like Audible credits that seem to be working out well.
Right, that works too. Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for being here.
Folks.
Hey guys.
See ya.
Bye.